Can you hear me, Coleman?
Oh, David, how are you, my dear friend, my brother?
Baruch Hashem, it's good to see you.
It's better to see you. You're looking great. This is really a great joy. I've been looking forward to our conversation for some time. It was almost a year ago when I was in LA that had the privilege and pleasure of being interviewed on your show, on your tremendous podcast. Just a few words about David. David is one of the most prominent and insightful Jewish journalists and journalists at large alive today. A man I deeply admire. You can read his columns, and if you'd like, after today's session, you can get in touch and you can receive his weekly emails. And he always has something to offer, a perspective you didn't expect, and most often it actually penetrates the layers and rhetoric of any particular social discourse or issue. And a particular favorite feature of David's is his positivity, is his insistence on seeing the silver lining in all. And we know how important that can be, especially of late. And so without further ado, David, welcome. It's a pleasure to see you. We still have tremendous memories of the time you joined us for a physical Shabbat here locally, and we look forward to a physical reunion, please God, in the not so distant future, please God.
Likewise, I'm looking forward to coming back to the new normal.
So on that note, David, we're going to ask you a few questions throughout the next few minutes. Tell me, what do you actually think will the new normal be like? And do you think that people will, in fact, be changed? You know, this is something we've hosted over the past weeks, a number of intellectuals, Steven Pinker from Harvard. We hosted Tal Ben-Shahar, also from Harvard, and a number of other public intellectuals. They were somewhat optimistic, but at the same time, were very reserved about real change. And my question to you is, do you think society will change? And if so, in what ways?
Well, something utterly fascinating has happened in the past few months. We've gone from arguably the biggest story of modern times, and right now here in America, it's been overshadowed by a new story, which is the riots and the fights against racism, right? It's unheard of to think that something could overcome COVID-19, right? So just on a macro level, it's kind of incredible. And in a certain sense, the second crisis is almost the exact opposite of the first. The first crisis was based on an invisible enemy, sneaky, lethal, and it was the kind of enemy that forced us to stay away from each other. I couldn't go to my minyan. I couldn't hang out with my friends. I couldn't go to any gathering. And then all of a sudden, you get this new enemy that's as visible as it gets. It's real people making real noises on real streets, fighting real injustice. The whole flip side, and even the image that started it all, is a real cop with a real knee on a real human neck. It's almost as if these riots have given us back our humanity in a way. After 2 months of living almost in an inhuman way, can you imagine that something shows up that tells a Chabad shliach he can't hang out and have his 20 guests on a Friday night Shabbat? That's like taking a basketball away from LeBron James. You know, it's not a normal enemy, COVID-19. It's an enemy that's as inhuman as it gets. You cannot hang out with your family. You cannot have that wedding, that simcha that you wanted. You cannot have a normal memorial. You can't have a normal shiva. It was as inhuman as it gets. And then this crazy moment happened when the image that was shown around the world on the death of George Floyd, it's the image that overtook COVID-19. And I think one of the reasons was there was something so human about it. So this is the phase we're in right now in America, is this issue of racism that dates back to 1619, when we had 244 years when slavery was legal. And even during the Emancipation Declaration of President Lincoln in 1863, you know, racial discrimination continued for another 101 years. So it's only in 1964 when we had the Civil Rights Act. But even that never really stopped racial discrimination. What it did is it gave Black Americans the tools the legal tools to fight it. So you're tapping into literally a 400 history of racism in this country. And it seems as if this moment in time has blown the gasket, like this literally outpouring. Now, what you're seeing is some very, it's very uncomfortable moments, because, you know, I think one of human nature is you have a tendency to take a good thing and go too far with it. So now many elements are going too far, because now the new slogan is not Black Lives Matter. The new slogan is defund the police.
Right.
So this is where we're at this stage right now, where how far are they going to go? Is there going to be a backlash? And it's unfortunate in a way that we're in this moment, because we're in an election year, right? And when you're in an election year, you know, things get, if it's polarized before, it's even more polarized now.
Right.
So, you know, I had a shliach from Chabad that wrote this amazing piece, Levi Shem Tov, and I published it last week. Mm-hmm. And he sees all the fighting now, and the biggest penalty we're paying right now is that the level of conversation is coarse. It's like, it's as lowered as I've ever seen it. It's almost as if the people have taken sides and nobody wants to have a conversation. They're just wanting to have an all-out war. So as far as the new normal, I'll tell you from my personal story, is when the quarantine hit, I realized week after week that I was getting, as a gift from God, 100 hours of free time that I never thought I'd have, right? I go to like galas and fundraisers almost every night in LA. Beverly Hilton, there's events all over town. So all of a sudden, I've got 100 hours that I'm used to schlepping on freeways and commuting and going to meetings, and God gave me these hundreds of hours that I had to decide what to do with. And this has happened to everybody I know. What do we do with all this extra time? Some people panicked and they became obsessive with staying away from danger, right? Other people use the time to really reflect and ask themselves questions they never asked themselves before. What really matters in life, you know? So one of the things we encouraged is to kind of go deep, so that use this crisis to go deep. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me jump in and ask you, because you brought up a very important question. I'm going to be a little bit personal. What are some of the questions you asked yourself that you didn't have time to ask before, or you evaded because they were just they might have created too much recalibration that you weren't ready for?
Yeah, you know, one of the best lines I heard was from a Reform rabbi in LA. He says, when you go through hell, make sure you don't come out empty-handed. It's this amazing line. It's like, this thing is such hell. I was seeing friends lose their businesses, seeing friends in the intensive care. I was seeing the death rate just increase from 10 to 20 to 70. Now it's 110,000 people have died. Real darkness. Right. And how do we come out of this hell not empty-handed? So look, I mean, one of the things I wrote is I want to come out a better father, a better boss, a better human, a better Jew. This is what things. So I'll tell you on a very simple level, Mendy, I started walking, you know, I was walking.
Right.
And I took started taking 2-3 long walks every day. And it kind of just made me settle down. I was on the same roads that I drive every day. I was seeing these unbelievable trees in my neighborhood. Right. And it gave me time to reflect. I started writing more. I spent more time with my kids. I started calling my mother. Instead of twice a week, I was calling her once or twice a day. I was very in tune with her loneliness. She's 87 years old. She lives in Montreal, you know, and I became in tune with other people's pain. And I started writing stories about other people's pain. So, but at the same time, I started a podcast. Because, you know, I literally woke up, I have a studio, you came to my studio at the office, and here I am, the Jewish Journal office is in Koreatown, we closed down. So all of a sudden, everything had to be done remote, And I said to my daughter, who's my producer, I said, what are we going to do? You know, she said, let's start a podcast. So literally on a whim, I set up a studio in my bedroom and I set up a podcast. I called it Pandemic Times at the very beginning, and I didn't know where it was going to go. And it became my morning routine, where I shared with my audience that this is going to be a journey. I don't know where it's going to go. So every morning I would wake up and I would tell people what's on my mind, right? And it was unbelievable. It's like I chronicled American history, and it became the theme of the podcast, became the dance between darkness and light. And I knew that I had listeners who were only in the darkness, and I had other listeners who were in denial, and they were only in the light. The ones who were only in darkness were consumed by fear, you know, and maybe they had good reason to be consumed by fear. Maybe they lost a business. Maybe they lost a family member. And the other group was consumed by silver linings. All they wanted to do was just spin it. Hidden blessings, silver linings. I'm baking cookies all day with my kids. I'm reading books I never read and all that kind of good stuff. And that's all they focused on. I'm listening to the Beatles like I never did. And I realized I had like the two worlds. And I said, I know it's kind of comfortable for human nature to kind of pick a side. It's comfortable. I'm going to pick one or the other. And I realized that's not how life works. So I decided that the theme became darkness and light. And let's see if we can keep those two in front of us. So the darkness is we feel the pain of people. It's real pain. We feel the pressure that healthcare workers who are working 18 hours a day, and people who are getting infected, and people who are dying, and people who are under ventilators, and people who are losing their businesses. That's the darkness, right? And then the light became all the action, the people, this outpouring of volunteerism and humanity. There's a shliach in LA, unbelievable. He decided he was going to deliver Friday night Shabbat meals, right? There's a lot of single Jews in LA who are used to getting invited for Shabbat. It's like a routine. Every Friday night they're invited. So the shliach saw, my God, you know, what are they going to do, right? Everything stopped. Every event in LA stopped. Every Shabbat party stopped. Everything stopped. So the shliach decided to get a whole group together, and now they're delivering a Shabbat meal every Friday afternoon to all these singles. It's amazing. So that's the light in dancing with the darkness. So I focused on both, and I'm still doing it.
Wow. Tell me something, David. Again, to go back to the Jewish community, how do you think Jewish communal life will change? I know you've written about a number of different features of Jewish life, including synagogues and so forth. What do you anticipate real change? And I guess the question is long-term change, because there's going to be short-term change. We're experiencing that, but human nature is such that we forget. We're forgetful creatures and beings, and we are creatures of habit and comfort, and we love social proximity. We love the energetic exchange between people. When we see each other, we look in their eyes and the smile reciprocates and we feel the vibe, etc. Good energy. What will Jewish life look like in the future, according to David Suissa?
Well, what I'm seeing now is, you know, you can never change a habit unless you replace it with another habit. So for 100 years, American Jewry got used to the habit of the big synagogue, right? It was the synagogue model. You get a nice big building, and you get a whole group of people that you pay your membership dues, and you come on Shabbat or once a year, and you network, and you schmooze, and you wallow in community.
Right.
That is the 100-year business model of American Judaism, whereas the synagogue was the center of American Judaism. And then you have life cycle. So some Jews, you know, you go until the bar mitzvah or the bat mitzvah, and then you kind of, you know, bow out. But whatever, whether it was small, medium, or large, it was all based around a physical structure, right? The COVID-19 crisis forced us to look in other areas. In my neighborhood right now, you've seen there's a proliferation of outdoor minions. So what I'm seeing now is a new habit where people are getting together in smaller groups, whether it's for socializing or whether it's for davening. It's social groups. I'm sorry, it's smaller groups. And also there's an obsession with outdoor. When I walk around my neighborhood on Shabbat, I can't tell you how many outdoor activities I see. People are now doing birthdays on sidewalks, right? Birthday parties, minions in the backyard. It's outdoor, it's smaller units. Judaism has moved back in a way into the home, right? Which is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely fascinating. So the big question is, when we will be allowed to daven the way we used to. Because remember, right now, some synagogues are starting to open. But here's the problem. It's really problematic because who wants to wear a mask for 3 hours while you daven? Who wants to have to register to go to a synagogue and know that you're going to be physically separated? And who wants to go to it? The whole reason we go to synagogue is precisely for physical proximity. I want to hug my buddies. Right. Synagogue is the exact opposite of social distancing.
Right.
Right? So we don't know how long it's going to take for the crisis to be so behind us that we're going to be able to go back to that old experience of the community. In the meantime, new habits are forming. Now, it's not all good and it's not all bad, because I think there's something to be said for making the home more important in Judaism. Right. And this is happening now. And I think there's something to be said for connecting with nature. There's a big return to nature now, and outdoors. And there's something to be said for smaller, more intimate groups. The question is, how long is it going to take before we can go back to the old synagogue experience? And the longer that takes, the more ingrained the new habits will kick in. And it's possible that we'll have a hybrid of both, that by the time we're back, it could be 6 months. There are rumors that even by the Tishrei, by Rosh Hashanah and the high holidays, the synagogues will not be ready to offer what they used to offer, right? And that's a problem.
So a few quick, I want to jump in a little bit because I found what you said really interesting. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the silver lining, if you will, is the relocation of Jewish spiritual life, or its epicenter, as it were, away from the big buildings and the institutionalized Judaism. And it's now more home-based Judaism, at least for the time being. This was always the vision of Judaism, mind you. Of course, the synagogue is an integral part of religious exercise and experience. You need a minyan and to read the Torah and so forth. But Judaism was, by the way, as it were, banished or confined to the synagogue a few hundred years ago, particularly during the Enlightenment period. There's a fascinating quote, David, I'm sure you came across it, by Reb Samson Raphael Hirsch, the great German rabbi. This is one of the most radical teachings I came across over the past few months. I'm going to quote to you what he said. If I had the power, I would provisionally close all synagogues for 100 years. Do not tremble at the thought of it, Jewish heart. What would happen? Jews and Jewesses without synagogues, desiring to remain such, would be forced to concentrate on a Jewish life and a Jewish home. The Jewish officials connected with the synagogue would have to look to the only opportunity now open to them to teach young and old how to build a Jewish home. All synagogues closed by Jewish hands would constitute the strongest protest against the abandonment of the Torah in home and life. And he was lamenting the fact that the premium role that was unduly projected upon synagogues and temples at that time was done so by, 19th century Germany, shifting the central focus from a home to those grandiose sanctuaries and cathedral-like synagogues, which is quite important. It's interesting, by the way, because the term temple is currently used in certain denominations or demographics for the synagogue. But the Talmud says that in the absence of the temple, where is the current Jewish temple? In your home. Your dining room table is like the altar where you bring the sacrifice, and your bedroom is the Holy of Holies. So it's quite amazing that in that respect, we do have that return. But David, 2 years ahead from now, do you really think there will be a dent, any imprint? Do you really think there will be a longer term change?
I think it's quite possible. As I heard you speak, Mendy, I was thinking of the Lubavitcher Rebbe it's kind of what he did was a really fascinating hybrid of both.
Very
When
true.
you think about it, you know, he really pushed his shluchim to invite people in their homes, so that when you have people who were experiencing Shabbat for the first time, they were coming to a structure, you know, a home where they did the davening as they would in a normal synagogue, but they also saw the Judaism of the home. So in a way, the Chabad house was a hybrid of both. You had the building for davening, but you had the home so somebody could see this is Judaism. Because, you know, the problem with big buildings is that you don't really have to do much. You know, it's not very demanding. You know, in many ways, you're part of the audience. You know, you're watching a show, you're watching a performance. In many synagogues, especially in the non-Orthodox world. And then what is left for you? What's left for you is you do a lot of schmoozing, right? You schmooze and you network. And in a certain sense, it's not as holy as could be, right? But you get used to that. And then it's your weekly habit. And when you get home, you figure, well, I've done my Judaism because I went to shul. And there's less pressure. But when you're home, it's more demanding. You have to do more. So I think we're tasting that right now. There's a major guy in town, even for davening. He said, you know, David, I interviewed him, and he said, ever since I started davening alone because of the crisis, he says he's getting closer to God. He's finding more meaning in the davening itself, something that he would not normally feel as much as he loves the social networking that he does in synagogue. How much of this is going to stick? It's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to say. I think part of it is how long are we going to be in this mode? I have friends of mine now who are saying they're not returning to a building. Why? Because they're absolutely loving the outdoor minyan in a backyard. And they love
you live in LA, David. Let me remind you, you live in LA, and it's possible there. In London,
it is. You're very right. Very true, very true. And next time you're here, I'll show you. But you get these real gorgeous backyards, and you're davening, and you know, people are not wearing masks outdoor. So, and they're creating their own kind of minions. Different people are doing the davening. They're doing different kind of Dvar Torahs contributed by different people. It's a new way of doing Shabbat. And I think a lot of it depends on how long this is going to continue. Right. If it goes on for 12 months, I think people are going to say, you know what, I really like this. Now, in the non-Orthodox world, Mandy, it's really important that there's a big difference because they're allowed to use Zoom on Shabbat, which makes an enormous difference. So in that world, you know, the technology has taken over. So there's not as much pressure to reopen the buildings, because people are now getting used to doing the Shabbat service at home, right? And yeah, go ahead.
No, but then the question is, they've been live streaming services for many years already. So the question is, what brought people to the synagogue while Zooming or live conferencing or live stream was happening? I think whatever brought people to the synagogue, even when Zoom was on offer, will continue to bring people to the synagogue.
Yeah, but there's a tremendous fear of being infected in that world. It's still very much there. And look, there's a lot of expenses that have to do with joining synagogues. There are huge membership fees. If the synagogue is going to be closed for the high holidays, you know, you don't need to buy tickets. Do you really want to make those big, you know, financial commitments? And that's becoming a major consideration in the non-Orthodox world, because people will not donate that much to a Zoom service, right? So and then the cost of carrying these buildings is also becoming a big issue. Remember, the fear of getting infected is big time. It's still very much there. Right. So you're thinking, you know, and if I have to go, do I really want to go to a synagogue right now and know I got to wear a mask for 2 hours? So I think you're seeing a situation where we don't know how long this is going to last, right? And the longer it goes on, the more people are going to be satisfied with an alternative. So you may end up with a situation where just like restaurants, they're going to open at 50%. You may end up with a situation where a percentage of people will go back to what they had before, and another percentage will settle for the home version.
What's very interesting is that actually in Chabad for decades already, we've been focused not on, a one-way street where we have a space and it's all about people coming into that space, but we meet people in their turf where they are. Portable Judaism to go. You think, mitzvah mobile homes or sukkah mobiles and chauffeur in the park. Many of those programs are actually now being replicated among other Orthodox institutions and synagogues who are saying, okay, now we need to take a page out of the Chabad playbook, because in reality, at least in this country, there's a lot of discussion around how high holiday services are going to be like. And so at least to perform the mitzvah of chauffeur, there's going to be some creativity and a proliferation of manpower and chauffeur blowers who will go individually, community, home to home, and so forth. David, if you're okay with it, I'm going to shoot some really quick rapid fire questions so that we get to enjoy knowing a little bit about you, a little more than we might otherwise, if you're happy for me to share some questions.
Go for it.
Okay. David, let's try to keep the answers, if we can, very short, because that's the nature of this segment. What keeps you up at night?
The level of conversation in America, that's where it is no longer possible to have a conversation. And the biggest fear right now is the fear of saying something wrong.
Wow. Do you struggle with that as a journalist often?
Big time. Yeah, there is a movement afoot where anybody in America right now, any CEO could lose their career, their jobs in 1 minute just by tweeting something as simple as all lives matter, or they're against anything that's politically incorrect can get you fired. And you can just, I'll alert your viewers to the situation that happened with the New York Times, where the head of the opinion section lost his job because he published an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton, which was really ridiculous. So it's the mob. The mob is on the warpath. And the biggest fear right now is the fear of saying something wrong. Really sad development.
David, it's very interesting because the Talmud talks about the end of times. That is in the signs of Moshiach's arrival. And one of the signs it says is it compares the leaders of the time to dogs. Now, that sounds like a horrific statement. The commentaries explain what that means is that there is a certain characteristic of a dog. A dog runs in front of its owner, but at some point turns around to look to see if its owner is close behind, and then adjusts its movements based on where its owner is. And in that respect, some of the commentaries say that the leaders or the thought leaders, the intellectuals, the public commentators, they will have to adjust themselves to the masses and look behind or over their shoulder regularly to ensure that they're actually not violating the quote unquote unsafe, safe space, very intolerant tolerance, and all of those paradoxes and oxymorons that have created and that have stifled discourse today. So
I'd love to see that, Mendy. If you can send me a link of that, that's kind of fascinating. The new heroes in America right now are the victims, the powerless of all the power.
Oof, wow,
and look, victimhood is very seductive, and it's really spooking the leadership, just like you said in your analogy right now. And it's really shrinking and shriveling the conversation. And we're trying to, at the Jewish Journal, to still enrich the conversation in any way we can. But it's not easy because everybody's worried about saying the wrong thing.
Fascinating. Tal Ben Shachar spoke about that, how the level of discourse has been diminished to sound bites, 144 characters. There's no room, there's no depth, there's no nuance. And that's an unfortunate precursor to polarization and to entrenched political, ideological civil war. David,
yeah, it's emotionalism. It's emotionalism.
Yeah.
And when you focus so much on emotion, when going out onto the streets and screaming, you're not really thinking of solutions.
Right.
You know, you're replacing real solutions and constructive action by just screaming and yelling, and it looks good on social media. But at the end of the day, are you really helping the blacks in the inner cities? Are you really moving things forward? Not really. So this is the state we're in, and the Jews can come into the picture. The Jewish way is to really, the Talmudic way, is to look at the issue and dissect it and see how we can move forward. And that's my hope, is that the Jewish community in America will bring something more constructive to the conversation.
Fascinating. We had the ballerina of Auschwitz last week. We had an amazing conversation with Dr. Edith Eger. If you can get her on your podcast, I'd highly recommend it. She wrote a book called The Choice, which is definitely in the genre of man's search for meaning. An amazing woman. And she said a quote there, instead of asking why me, ask what now. That's a very Jewish question. And that has ensured that the Jewish people rise above their victimhood or victimization, and separate victimization from victimhood. So David, a quick question. Steven Pinker and others suggest that actually the world is more tolerant now than ever before, that actually our attitudes towards minorities and differences and so forth is much more understanding and more gentle and more compassionate. I would actually say that the very outrage we're seeing around the world is a demonstration of the way in which humanity has moved towards positive, inclusive movements for social justice and so forth. Would you agree? Would you say that in your lifetime you feel that the world has become more tolerant and more compassionate?
If you study the past 50 years, since the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's been an enormous growth in human rights in America. The rights of gays, the rights of women, and the rights of blacks, enormous. Now, in the 60s, you know, they used to have restaurants where it said, you know, no colored people allowed. And when I tell my kids that, they're kind of shocked. They can't believe it. So you have to understand that human nature, a lot of the power that people got in the 60s came from fighting injustice. Fighting injustice is a very lucrative business. And here we are 50 years later, people realize that fighting injustice is a major source of power. But they realize also that you don't have the level of injustice you had in the 60s, where 50,000 men died in Vietnam and you had bombs falling all over the place. It was a lot worse. So you're seeing this kind of attempt to recreate the 60s in America. But the level of injustice is so far from what it used to be. But the desire to get power through the fight against injustice is still there. And, you know, I call it cheap power. The real power is when you create something for society, whether you add value to society, whether you open a company that hires people, or you write a book, or you create a film, or you create something that adds value to society. And right now we're at this stage of American history where people think that just yelling adds value. Being a victim adds value. And the truth is it doesn't. And then reality kind of hits you square in the face. You wake up one day, you've been to 300 demonstrations, and your resume is still the same. You haven't improved your skill set. You've done nothing for your career. And I think there's a disillusionment here because of social media especially, right? So it magnifies everybody. We didn't have iPhones in the 60s.
Right.
Now everything is being recorded, right? So, and I think that the thing that happened with George Floyd made it look like it's a horrible situation. But if your listeners go to National Review Online, there are several articles. I will refer you to Heather McDonald. She wrote the book, The War on Cops, and you will be shocked at how much better things have been for blacks. Shocked. It's unbelievable. I mean, just the level of the level of when a white cop kills a black person, it's like you're 18 times more likely for a black person to kill a white cop than vice versa. There were 15 3 years ago, there were 9 last year. So, but what happens was if you film one event, then it makes it look like the whole police force is racist, and it's so wrong.
Why is that message not coming through? Why is that why are the public intellectuals not speaking about this data, which is really indicative of progress? That is not to diminish the problem, and it's not to write it off, but to really create some type of balance. Another aspect, defund the police is not the solution. We need the police. We need a more compassionate police. They need to be more trained in de-escalation. By the way, in this country, I have to say, every encounter I've had with a police officer has always been wonderful. It's been very positive. There's no fear when a police officer interacts with you here because by and large, first of all, they don't have weapons. And they've been trained. They have many more hours of de-escalation training. And by the way, because they have no weapons, they need that de-escalation training because they can't rely or fall back on a gun. They need to use their communication skills. And it's really had amazing productive results. So yes, we could talk about reform, but defund the police, that sounds like anarchy. That's not going to bring our world forward.
Well, you asked a really good question. Why do people not push back? And you're talking here about a lot of white guilt, right? What's called virtue signaling. In America, it's really good for your career. If you look like you're really woke, if you're left-wing, if you're liberal, and if you're on the side of the African Americans, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement and so forth, you have to understand that the left has very much taken over the cultural institutions in America, whether it's Hollywood or academia. You know, it is run by the left. It is run by the 60s revolutionaries of, the hippies are now running the cultural systems in America. And you can see it now even in the media. So you have Hollywood, the media, and academia. You know, all the students, they're now running this country, the institutions. You look at Google and Twitter. These are, leftist run organizations. So they have a real interest in conveying and in appeasing the left. And then what you're also seeing with defunding the police is an attempt at power, because they want Hollywood, academia, and the media, and now they want to take over law enforcement. So it's not really defund the police, it's replace the police with their own. So they want to take over. There's a tremendous power grab going on in America. It's very much about power. And this is what you see. And unfortunately, I mean, I don't want to sound cynical, but it's the reality right now. It's a power grab. They have a different vision of America. You have two sides that have a different vision of where this country should go. And
David,
one side,
an honest question. Do you think we've crossed the line beyond no return? I hate to ask it that way. Do you think America could become the United States, e pluribus unum? Do you think it's possible, and how?
Well, it's amazing you ask me this, because yesterday I was having the same conversation. Have we passed the point of no return? I think until November we have, right now, because everybody's in war mode right now. They just want to win. They want to grab power. Right. They want to use whatever is happening in society to beat up the other guy, to beat up the other side. So people have taken sides. Until the election in November, we're going to see definitely we passed the point of any kind of decent conversation. It doesn't mean I'm not going to try, but I think it's important to have shows like we're having right now where people see the reality, and within this reality, this darkness, we can still introduce Judaism, introduce the Talmud, introduce Hasidut. I think there's an even bigger responsibility that within the craziness of the macro situation, we can have in our own pockets, in our own families, in our own communities, see if we can make a difference. So in a way, we can let the country, fail, but we will not let our communities fail. In your community in London, you will go against the common black and white fights that we're seeing.
It's interesting because as you know, in the book Positivity Bias, I described this in length in the last chapter, Where Our World is Headed. The Hasidic perspective on the storyline of history is such that as history evolves and progresses, the top-down models disintegrate, are dismantled, and real progress happens from the bottom up on a grassroots level. And I think what you just tapped into is exactly that. Real change will happen on the grassroots level and rather than on an institutional level. David, let's jump back into the crossfire for a few moments. What's your favorite book and why?
Wow. Oh, man. I got too many. Well, I have to tell you, there's a book I go back to all the time. It's called The Sabbath by Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Yes.
Because,
Yes,
you know, if I read it on Tuesday, I get a taste of Shabbos because I love Shabbos so much. So if I had to pick one, I think I would pick that one.
Interesting. And how about a non-Jewish book?
Non-Jewish book. I like Freedom by Jonathan Franzen. Let's see, a non-Jewish book. I'm reading right now Lionel Trilling, The Obligations of Intelligence. Lionel Trilling. It was edited by Leon Wieseltier. It's fascinating essays. He was a brilliant man from the 50s. I guess that's not Jewish, but I read a lot of nonfiction.
Right.
My favorite type of book is collection of essays. So if you go into any, like the Atlantic, a few years ago had their best essays from 100 years. If anybody of your viewers love essay writing, I highly recommend that.
What's
I have a book. Yeah, I think it's Insurrections of the Mind. It's the 100-year anniversary of the Atlantic, and they give you their top essays for 100 years. And it's an absolutely fascinating overview of American history.
Amazing. Which book changed your life most?
Which book changed my life? You know, I don't know if one book changed my life.
Okay.
I can't
Which
say
teacher changed your life?
Which what? Preacher?
Teacher.
Oh, teacher. Okay. I was obsessed with William Safire for 30 years. He was a columnist in the New York Times, and I read every column he ever wrote. And he had a language column on Sunday. And I'm an immigrant. You know, we moved to Canada from Morocco in the 60s, and I fell in love with English. So when I was like 8 years old, I started writing English stories, and I loved the English language since we moved to Canada. And William Safire is my favorite writer, and I read him to this day. If you want great essays, you read anything from William Safire. So he changed me. I studied his columns. I didn't just read them, I studied them. And because I've written a weekly column for 14 years now, he's still my mentor, even though he passed away 8 years ago.
David, favorite song and why?
Oh, favorite song is The Second Side of Abbey Road.
Okay.
Second Side of Abbey Road changed my life. I mean, when I went to camp when I was I think I was 15 years old, and we played it. It was Camp Neighborhood. We played it. We played the second side every day for like 30 days. It had the most amazing medley. It's like one song moved into another. It almost like the history of pop music was on that one side. And it just moved and flowed. It had an ebb and flow. It had darkness. It had light. It had whimsy. It's just an extraordinary experience. The Second Side of Abbey Road. I highly recommend it.
Okay. How about your favorite prayer and why?
My favorite what?
Prayer.
I didn't hear that.
Your favorite prayer.
Oh, my favorite prayer. It's the Akedah. It's a Sephardic prayer on the that we sing at Rosh Hashanah, and it's on the sacrifice of Isaac. I'll have to email you the exact link because I don't think they sing it in Ashkenazi synagogues, but it's the most beautiful melody ever. In fact, I sang it for Michael Jackson. I was in his house. Yeah, I was in his house literally. And then we were on the road, and I wrote about it, and I'll send you the link. And he asked me for my favorite melody, and I told him my favorite melody is a Sephardic tune we sing on Rosh Hashanah, and I sang it for him.
How did he react?
It's my favorite prayer. Well, you know, he just said, it's beautiful. And there's also Ein Keloenu in Ladino.
Wow.
It's absolutely beautiful Ladino prayer. Once in a while, I'll sing it in an Ashkenazi shul. And Untana Tokep for the Ashkenazi version is beautiful. And then the you know, hi, yeah, what do you call that?
Volcano, yes.
Yeah. It's,
Okay,
I've done many of those.
These are tough questions, but who would you say was the most interesting person you've ever met?
Most interesting person I've ever met. Yossi Klein Halevi.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah. I met him, you know, I used to be a huge fan of his writing.
Right.
And somebody introduced us 20 years ago. And he was an amazing political analyst. And I read all his political stuff. So I finally met him. He's my hero.
Wow.
And for 2 hours, we talked about God. I had no idea. Yossi meditated every morning. He had a whole spiritual side that I knew nothing about. He's really into music.
Yeah.
And he's just a fan. And we became very close friends. And then and I admire him to no end.
I met him for the first time. I was doing a journalism course with Sam Friedman from the New York Times. And he used to bring in a few like public intellectuals, and I met Yossi, and I've also been in touch. He's an amazing guy. Let me ask you this. What's your favorite Jewish joke?
Jewish joke. So somebody goes to somebody else and said, could you lend me $50? And the guy says, sorry, I only have 25. And the other guy says, okay, give me the 25 and you owe me 25.
Okay. Let me ask you this. If you could have lunch with anyone alive, who would it be and why?
Well, I have to tell you, it'd have to be the President of the United States.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, just
what
because
would that look like?
I would want to influence him, and I would want to know, and I would want to reaffirm his connection to Israel and his support for Israel. So I'm being very selfish here, you know, because I love, you know, there's nothing more important to Israel than the relationship with America and the support of America. And I'm so grateful that the most powerful parliament in human history is so much on the side of Israel, that America is on the side of Israel. So I have a special place in my heart for that. And I figured, why not? If I have the opportunity to strengthen that connection, I will take advantage.
That's fascinating. Okay. And if you can go back in time and choose a character from Jewish history to have dinner with, who would it be?
Definitely Maimonides.
And why?
Yeah. Maimonides, because I want to see how he blended this ability to write the deepest text ever and still be a doctor that practiced all day long and be a leader of the community. This was this fascinating ability to do so many things at once. This is a guy who traveled to Egypt to help for medical reasons, some of the leaders there, and he was involved in the community with fundraising and all that kind of stuff and building institutions. And then he wrote one of the deepest texts in human history, the Guide to the Perplexed. And on top of that, the Mishneh Torah, where he gets into the weeds of halacha. I just can't imagine how anybody could do so much. So I would want to know how he kind of was able to do all that. That's in the
fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
The non-Jewish would be guaranteed Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, really? And why?
Yeah. Well, I'm a Lincoln buff because, first of all, his writing, his ability to think. He was also able to transcend depression. He lost 2 children. He married a woman. He never married the woman he loved. He married a woman that he had a horrible marriage. He had deep depression, and still he was able to transcend the depression, not just to compartmentalize, but to use the intensity of his depression to become a better human being and a better president. Just extraordinary. I have unlimited admiration for Lincoln. Cambridge in England, University, had a contest many years ago. They were looking for the example of the best English writing ever. And what they settled on was a letter that Abraham Lincoln wrote to a mother who lost 5 boys in the Civil War. All her 5 boys. And then he found a way, and you'll find it online, Mendy, and you can send it to your viewers. And you'll see.
Sounds incredible.
Yeah.
Actually, if I can just interject, you can actually see that that letter in Saving Private Ryan.
Correct. Somebody gave it to me as a gift. once.
David,
And I actually read it constantly. I go back to it. I read it to my kids, and you read it. It's just, it's a little bit like the Gettysburg Address, you know, so much intensity and power in so few words. And then what do you say to a woman who lost 5 boys and not make it, you know, just patronizing and
do you have a favorite film, David?
a favorite film?
Yeah.
Once Upon a Time in America.
Wow. Why is that?
I think the artistry, it was like The Godfather for Jews, and it was the history of Jewish gangsters in America, but they had an aesthetic quality. It was like a Picasso painting on a canvas for 4 hours. The cinematography, the music, the thing is 4 hours and 15 minutes. And it was the epic scope of the film, and then the really intimate moments of relationships. And you see Jews, the other side of Jews, you know, Jews who are gangsters. And then the acting, James Woods and Robert De Niro and Elizabeth McGovern. The whole thing for me was just an utter masterpiece where you can see violence, but you're not really thinking about the violence. You're thinking about the extraordinary artistry of the film. I really loved it, including the music. So that was my film. But I got 100. I'm a movie nut, so don't get me started on films.
Would you like to work on a movie ever?
I would like to work on a movie. I'd like to work on a documentary of the Rebbe.
Wow.
If,
Me and you have something in common, at least.
yeah.
Anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Chabad story is one of the greatest stories in Jewish history. I think this is something where we don't realize it as it's happening, but to think that, you know, there are like 100 countries in the world, and my daughter's got her boat is breaking down in Thailand on a thing, and then she calls me. Next thing you know, I'm on the phone with a shliach in Thailand, and he's got another shliach on another island who's got his own boat. I mean, I have 100 of these stories.
David,
around the world.
David,
you know, it's one thing, Mendy, to tell your wife we're going to go on a cruise in Alaska. It's another thing to say we're going to move there for 80 years, right? So I think this idea of covering the globe with Jewish resources and Jewish emissaries, whether you're in some jungle in Africa or South America, and you know, I've met so many of them. I think it's just an extraordinary movement. The level of personal sacrifice to put shoes on the ground. And really become a human resources everywhere you go around the world. It's one of the greatest stories. It's one of the few things I never get tired of talking about is the sacrifice of Chabad around the world. Not everyone is lucky like you to be in London.
You know what? I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I'm personally deeply inspired every kinnos precisely when I hear those stories of extraordinary physical, emotional, and spiritual sacrifice. I mean, I have a cousin in Ghana, Africa. Personally, before getting married, I traveled to over 50 countries. I helped start Chabad in Cambodia, in Hanoi, and in Laos and other parts of the world. It was interesting when we showed up to Vietnam for Rosh Hashanah, the Chabad couple had just moved there. Just getting out of the taxi, there was an Israeli film crew. And I asked him, what is this about? He said this couple came to see how a Chabad house opens from day one. So they tracked down a couple considering going to Vietnam. They videoed them in their home, deliberating in the airport, parting with their family, coming to Vietnam. They ended up airing it on Israeli television, and the title was Good Shabbos Vietnam.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Well, I did Good Shabbos Guatemala, you know, a few months ago. I went on a trip to Guatemala, and next thing you know, I'm halfway around the world. I go in this place, and it's like poverty from the third world. And you see this huge image of the Rebbe, this beautiful garden, this restaurant, unbelievable. And it turns out they have a restaurant in the Chabad, and I forget the actual city. And so I asked the shliach, I said, what are your hours for the restaurant? And he says, my hours, anytime a Yid is hungry.
Like Abraham, like our father Abraham.
Totally.
Finally, let me ask you 2 more questions, David. What are you most proud of? What achievement in life are you most proud of? What do you see as your greatest success?
Well, you know, I mean, I have 5 kids, and that's, my God, that's the greatest thing I've ever done in my life. Professionally, when I became a writer, I had done 30 years of advertising, and then I wrote a column in August of '06. And becoming a writer changed my life. Like, that's my biggest.
Did you always feel like, I wish I could have the time to write, I would love to write? Or was it sort of just a transformation that came over you because of circumstances?
It was both. I always wanted to write, but in the advertising, you're writing for a client, you're writing to sell, you're writing for somebody else's agenda. So in the back of my mind, it was kind of like detox. Writing a Jewish story was just therapy for me, because there was no agenda except for the story itself. And because I'd been an avid reader my whole life, it kind of, I fell naturally into it, but I never in a million years thought that I would become like a professional columnist, and never. But I really spent so much time working at it to try to really deliver something original and insightful to my readers. I think maybe the advertising helped, because in advertising, the number one commandment is thou shalt not bore.
Right.
So when I write, I really keep that in mind, that how do I write something that's going to add something to somebody's life?
Interesting. David, two more questions. I know I said two before. How would you like to be remembered?
Oh, well, a good father and a good Jew.
That's beautiful. Short, sweet, to the point. Wow. Okay. And finally, what message do you have? What practical takeaway can you give us here? Maybe one practical practice you would recommend for growth, or to better the world, a practice or a piece of advice, a ritual, something that has you maybe personally changed your life in terms of creating something, a grounded point within your daily schedule, whatever it might be, something you can leave us with to help us all become better fathers, mothers, and better Jews.
When I started my career at Procter & Gamble in marketing, there was a superstar. His name was David Rutherford. And I moved over to Ogilvy & Mather, an ad agency, and that's where he was. And I had heard so much about him. I decided to contact him for a meeting. And he gave me 10 minutes. And at the end of the 10 minutes, I said, David, if you had to give me one advice for the rest of my life, this was 1980, one advice for the rest of my life, what would it be? And he's a very deep man and really thoughtful, as good as it gets and as bright as it gets. And he had a beard, and he really thought about it for a long time. And you can see that he wanted to say the right thing. And after all of that thinking, all he said to me was, if you're ever in a meeting, when you're in a meeting and you have something to say, make sure you add to the meeting. It was the most innocuous, simple thing I'd ever heard. At the time, I didn't realize how big it was. And it has served me my whole life, because I've used it in everything I do. So the advice here is, what are we adding to everything that we touch? What are we adding to a conversation? What are we adding to society? What are we adding to our relationship with our kids? What are we adding to our relationship with our spouse? What are we adding to the community? And I find that so much of what we do, instinctively doesn't really add. We either we repeat or we reinforce, but are we really adding? And it's a very high standard. I certainly don't meet it, all the time, but it's a standard that always is in front of me, especially when I write and especially when I speak. I'm always thinking, what can I add to somebody's life? Something they might not have heard before, an idea. So that's, if I had to give you one piece of advice, that would be it.
That's actually very fascinating. It actually resonates very much because, as a rabbi, your main or one of the main requirements, or one of the main aspects of what we do is we have to deliver content very often, very regularly. And you can't just say the same thing everyone said already. And I challenged myself to never give a sermon that I gave before. I'm working on it. It's not an easy thing, because sometimes, because of pressures of time, and Chabad rabbis are not typical pulpit rabbis, 9 to 5, etc. We're entrepreneurial rabbis, startup rabbis, and so on. So we have lots of different aspects. And so it's something that resonates with me. Say something that people don't know. Now, it's important to reinforce very often, but try to find the angle or the way to present it that people have not heard before. Fascinating. David, what can I say but thank you, Toda Rabbah, from my heart. It's always a joy to connect with you. Your smile and your energy is radiant, especially in person, but across thousands of miles, we feel it in these moments. And we just want to bless you and tell you to be strong. Chazak, chazak v'ematz. Be that voice of courage, conviction, be original, be creative, be fearless. And please God, you will touch and illuminate and activate so many other people and lives in so doing. Blessings for good health, prosperity, serenity, peace of mind, and the power to continue to grow from strength to strength. Lots of love, David.